For nearly 6 decades, Charlie Watts was the one constant in a band famous for its chaos. While Mick Jagger commanded stages in front of millions and Keith Richards built a reputation as rock and roll's most lovable outlaw, Charlie sat quietly behind his drum kit, never missing a beat, never chasing the spotlight, and never asking for more than the music itself. He was the anchor. The steady hand. The heartbeat that kept the Rolling Stones alive through every storm, every scandal, and every decade that threatened to tear them apart. And when Charlie Watts passed away on August 24, 2021, the world expected his legendary bandmates to be standing at his graveside, heads bowed, paying their final respects to the brother who had given everything to the band they built together. But they weren't there. Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, and Ronnie Wood, 3 of the most recognizable faces in music history, were nowhere to be seen at Charlie's funeral. No public farewell. No graveside tribute. Just silence from the men who had shared stages, studios, and more than half a century of life with the man now being laid to rest without them. The moment the news broke, the internet erupted. Fans who had followed the Rolling Stones for decades couldn't believe what they were reading. Theories spread fast. Some said it was a feud that had been brewing for years behind closed doors. Others claimed Jagger had never truly respected Charlie, pointing back to old stories of tension and ego clashes within the band. A few went further, suggesting the split ran so deep that the remaining Stones had already moved on before Charlie's body was even cold. The headlines were damning. The rumors were vicious. And the silence from the band only made everything worse. But here is what almost nobody stopped to ask in the middle of all that noise. What if the real story had nothing to do with feuds, resentment, or betrayal? What if the truth behind one of rock history's most heartbreaking absences was far more complicated, far more human, and in many ways far more painful than any falling out could ever be? Because the truth, when you actually find it, doesn't make you angry. It makes you feel the weight of loss all over again. It reminds you that even legends are not immune to the circumstances that trap ordinary people. And it forces you to look at Charlie Watts one final time, not as a rock icon, but as a man who deserved a better goodbye than the one the world gave him. That story starts long before the funeral. It starts at the very beginning. Charles Robert Watts was born on June 2, 1941, in Bloomsbury, London, during a time when the city was still bleeding from the wounds of World War II. The streets around him were scarred by bomb damage. Families lived in temporary homes built to replace what the war had destroyed. His father drove lorries for the railway. His mother worked in a factory. There was nothing glamorous about the world Charlie Watts entered, and yet from the very beginning, something about him was different. While other children played in the rubble of post-war London, Charlie was listening. Really listening. To the rhythms drifting out of neighboring windows, to the scratchy sounds of old jazz records spinning on borrowed turntables, to a musical world that most people his age hadn't even discovered yet. It was in Wembley, in a small prefabricated house that barely kept out the cold, where Charlie first found the thing that would define his entire life. His neighbor, a boy named Dave Green, shared his obsession with jazz. Together, the two of them would spend entire afternoons hunched over a record player, working through stacks of 78 revolutions per minute records, discovering legends like Charlie Parker and Jelly Roll Morton while the rest of their generation was moving in a completely different direction. Most kids wanted to be footballers or film stars. Charlie wanted to understand why a drummer could make a room feel like it was breathing. That curiosity never left him. When his family moved to Kingsbury and Charlie enrolled at Tyler's Croft Secondary Modern School, he showed talent in art, football, and cricket. But the drums kept pulling him back. His first attempt at building his own instrument came from a banjo he bought and promptly dismantled, removing the neck because he had no interest in playing it the way it was designed. He wanted percussion. He wanted rhythm. He wanted to recreate what he heard when drummer Chico Hamilton played, that effortless, understated pulse that made jazz feel like a conversation rather than a performance. In 1955, Charlie received his first real drum kit as a Christmas gift. It cost $12. It changed everything. By the time he finished school and enrolled at Harrow Art School, Charlie had already been performing with local jazz groups alongside his childhood friend Dave Green. He was balancing a career as a graphic designer with late nights in smoky clubs, playing music for audiences who barely noticed him.
And that, strangely, suited him perfectly. Charlie Watts never needed to be noticed. He just needed to play.
What nobody around him realized was that those quiet nights in those forgotten clubs were leading him directly toward the biggest stage in the world. By 1962, London's rhythm and blues scene was alive with a kind of electric restlessness that felt like something enormous was about to happen. Clubs were packed every night with young musicians who had grown up listening to American blues records and decided they wanted to create something of their own. The air in those rooms smelled like cigarette smoke and ambition, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, Charlie Watts was sitting behind a drum kit, playing jazz with the quiet precision that had defined him since childhood.
He wasn't looking for anything new.
He had steady work, a reliable income, and a musical life that made sense to him.
And then he met the Rolling Stones.
Brian Jones, Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, and Ian Stewart were still a ragged collection of young men with more hunger than experience. They were playing wherever anyone would have them, sharing cramped apartments, and scraping together barely enough money to keep the band alive. When they first crossed paths with Charlie through the interconnected world of London's music scene, they recognized immediately what he brought to a room.
It wasn't just technical skill, though that was undeniable. It was something harder to name. A steadiness. A confidence that didn't need to announce itself.
Charlie Watts made every band around him sound better simply by being present. But joining the Rolling Stones was not an easy decision.
Charlie already had what the young Stones desperately wanted: stability.
He was earning money as a graphic designer, playing regular gigs, and building a life that made practical sense.
The Stones couldn't even guarantee they would survive another 6 months.
Keith Richards would later admit that they couldn't afford to pay Charlie when they first asked him to join, and that asking him to give up his security for their uncertain future felt almost embarrassing. But something about the band's raw energy convinced Charlie to take the risk.
In January 1963, he officially said yes.
His first public appearance as a permanent member of the Rolling Stones came on February 2, 1963, at the Ealing Jazz Club. Nobody in that room could have imagined what they were witnessing. The band that would one day sell out stadiums on every continent, that would release some of the most recognizable songs in music history, and that would outlast trends and generations and the deaths of their own members, was playing that night to a small crowd in a modest club. And behind the kit, quiet and focused and completely in his element, was Charlie Watts. Exactly where he was supposed to be. From that night forward, the Rolling Stones never sounded the same. And neither did rock and roll. There is a story that Keith Richards tells in his autobiography that perfectly captures who Charlie Watts really was beneath the calm exterior the world always saw. It was sometime in the 1980s, during a period when tensions inside the Rolling Stones had reached a level that threatened to unravel everything they had built together. Mick Jagger, riding the wave of his own solo ambitions, had started to carry himself differently around the band. There was a growing distance between him and the others, a shift in attitude that the people closest to him could feel even when nothing was being said out loud. And then one night, in a hotel somewhere on the road, Jagger made a phone call that he almost certainly regretted for the rest of his life. It was late. Jagger had been drinking. He picked up the phone, dialed Charlie's room, and when Charlie answered, Jagger's first words were, "Where's my drummer?" Not Charlie. Not his bandmate. Not his friend of more than 20 years. His drummer. Like a piece of equipment waiting to be used. What happened next became one of the most retold moments in Rolling Stones history, not because it was violent or scandalous, but because it revealed something about Charlie Watts that his quiet public image had always kept hidden. Charlie didn't shout. He didn't slam the phone down. Instead, according to Richards, he got up, shaved carefully, put on one of his perfectly tailored Savile Row suits, sprayed on cologne, walked down the hallway to Jagger's room, and knocked on the door. When Jagger opened it, Charlie looked at him for a moment, then grabbed him by the collar and punched him. As Jagger stumbled backward, Charlie pointed at him and said, "Don't ever call me your drummer again. You're my singer." The room went silent. And then it was over. Charlie straightened his jacket, turned around, and walked back to his room. That moment tells you everything about Charlie Watts. He was not a man who accepted disrespect quietly. He was not a man who let the noise of fame distort his sense of self-worth. Beneath the stillness, beneath the perfectly pressed suits and the understated professionalism, there was a man with an unshakable understanding of his own value.
He knew what he contributed.
He knew what the Rolling Stones would have been without him. And he refused, even once, to let anyone reduce him to a supporting role in a story he had helped write from the very first page.
He never needed the spotlight.
But he always knew exactly where he stood. But Charlie Watts was not a man without struggles. The image of the quiet, disciplined musician was real, but it was only part of the story. In the 1980s, during a period when the Rolling Stones were at the height of their fame and influence, Charlie found himself caught in something far more personal and far more devastating than any feud or ego clash. Like many people around him, he had started using drugs and alcohol as a way to cope with pressures that never seemed to ease. The touring never stopped. The expectations never diminished. The noise of being a member of the biggest rock band in the world never quieted down. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, Charlie lost his way. His daughter would later describe how different he looked during those years, how the man she knew as her father seemed to be disappearing into someone she didn't recognize. The addiction stretched from 1983 to 1986, 3 years of his life that he would later describe as a kind of midlife crisis, a period when he questioned everything about who he was and what he had become. Unlike some of his bandmates who seemed to embrace the lifestyle, Charlie had never wanted any of it. But once he was caught in it, getting out felt almost impossible. What pulled him back was not willpower alone. It was love. It was Shirley, his wife of more than 2 decades, the woman who had stood by him through every tour, every scandal, every moment when the world seemed determined to tear him apart.
It was also an accident that became a turning point.
In 1986, Charlie broke his ankle during a performance, an injury that forced him to stop, to sit still, and to finally face what he had become. In that stillness, he made a decision. He walked away from drugs and alcohol completely. He never returned to that world again. Keith Richards, despite his own notorious battles with addiction, became one of Charlie's strongest supporters during those years. Richards recognized in his friend a man who was genuinely trying to reclaim his life, and he encouraged him every step of the way. By the late 1980s, Charlie Watts had not only survived his addiction, he had transformed it into something that looked almost like wisdom. He had been to the bottom of a very dark place and clawed his way back out. And that experience, painful as it was, made him understand himself in ways that the rest of the world never could. He was a man who could face his own darkness and choose light anyway.